Before the waiter had finished pouring the wine, before the candle on the table had even caught its full flame, a voice from the back seat of a black sedan parked across the street asked a question that made three armed men stop breathing. "Who is he?" The voice didn't rise. It didn't crack. It carried the kind of quiet that made rooms go cold and grown men forget their own names. Two words. That was all. But the man who spoke them had built an empire on the understanding that violence didn't need volume. It only needed certainty. Through the rain-streaked window of the car, Dominic Sarova watched a woman he had once held in his arms lean across a candlelit table in a restaurant he had never seen, and laugh. Really laugh. The kind that tilted her head back and closed her eyes, at something another man had said. The man sitting across from her was smiling. He reached across the table and touched her hand. And she let him. Dominic's jaw tightened by a single degree. His left hand, resting on his knee, did not move. His breathing did not change. But the three men inside the sedan, Brennan in the driver's seat, Kostel behind him, and Jurek beside Dominic, all felt the shift. The way you feel the pressure drop before a storm breaks the horizon. The air didn't just get heavier. It changed composition entirely, as though the oxygen had been quietly replaced by something flammable, and all it needed was a single spark. "Find out," Dominic said. "Everything." The restaurant was called Lariones. It sat on the corner of Voss and Cathedral, a narrow limestone building with arched windows and black iron flower boxes that still held the dried remains of last season's geraniums. It had been open for 11 years, owned by a retired French-Algerian couple who served a fixed menu on weeknights and played Chet Baker through speakers hidden behind the curtain rods. It was the kind of place that didn't advertise. The kind you found because someone whispered its name to you over coffee. The kind where the tables were spaced far enough apart that you could cry into your soup, and the couple beside you would never know. The lighting was amber and forgiving. The walls were exposed brick softened by age. A single shelf behind the bar held 17 bottles of wine arranged not by vintage, but by the owner's mood that morning. Outside, the November rain had turned the sidewalks into dark mirrors. The streetlights on Cathedral stretched long reflections across the wet asphalt, broken only by the occasional car passing through. Across the street, a row of older buildings stood shoulder to shoulder. A dry cleaner that had closed at 6, a bookshop with a cat sleeping in the window display, a tailor whose name was stitched in gold thread on a black awning that had begun to fray at the edges. The neighborhood was called Sable Crossing. It had once been the commercial heart of the city's south end, busy with foot traffic and weekend markets. But that was 15 years ago. Now it had the quiet of a place that had made peace with being overlooked. The storefronts that remained were kept alive by stubbornness and regularity, not ambition. People who lived here didn't talk about the neighborhood improving. They talked about it holding on. Larion's was the jewel of that holding on. And tonight, on a Tuesday in late November, its warm glow spilled out through the arched windows and onto the wet street, like a small, defiant act of beauty in a city that had largely stopped noticing. Marette Vale had not laughed like that in 4 years. She knew this because she had kept a kind of internal calendar, not of dates, but of sensations. She could mark time by the last occasion her body had done something without permission from her survival instincts. The last time she had fallen asleep without checking the lock twice. The last time she had answered her phone without her heartbeat climbing into her throat. The last time she had sat across from a man in a restaurant and felt her shoulders settle away from her ears. That last time had been 4 years ago, before Dominic, before the first year of courtship that had felt like devotion, before the 3 years that followed, when devotion slowly revealed itself as something else entirely. She was 32 now. Her hair was dark auburn, cut shorter than she used to wear it, just below the jawline. A decision she'd made 5 months ago in a bathroom mirror the morning after she'd finally left. She'd held the scissors and thought about all the times Dominic had run his fingers through her long hair and told her it was beautiful and meant it was his. So she'd cut it, not out of spite, out of reclamation. Every inch that fell into the sink was a sentence she was taking back. Her eyes were hazel, the kind that changed with the light. Gold green in the afternoon, darker in the evening, almost amber by candlelight, which is what they were now as she sat across from Isaac Mendre and listened to him describe, with completely unnecessary dramatic flair, the time his 6-year-old nephew had tried to give a serious book report on a cereal box. Marit laughed. Not the controlled, measured laugh she had perfected during her years with Dominic. The one that was never too loud, never too long, never at the wrong moment. But a real laugh. The kind that escaped before you could catch it. The kind that made your eyes water and your hand reach for the table to steady yourself. Isaac grinned at her from across the table. He had a face that was hard to read on first impression and impossible to forget on second. Angular, olive-skinned, with deep-set brown eyes and a nose that had clearly been broken at least once and reset slightly off-center, which somehow made him more interesting to look at rather than less. He was 35. He taught history at a community college on the East Side. He wore a navy blazer over a white shirt with no tie, and his watch was the kind you bought at a street market in Lisbon and wore until the band fell apart because you liked the memory more than the object. He was, by every metric Maret had learned to measure men against during her years with Dominic, not dangerous. He did not fill a room when he entered it. He did not track her movements with his eyes. He did not ask where she had been, or who she had spoken to, or why she had taken 11 minutes to answer a text instead of 3. He asked her what book she was reading. He asked her if she'd ever tried the cardamom ice cream from the place on Felter Street. He asked her what kind of music she listened to when she was driving alone at night with the windows down. These were not the questions of a man who wanted to own someone. These were the questions of a man who wanted to know someone. And the difference, which Marit could now identify with the precision of a woman who had lived on the wrong side of that line for far too long, was everything. This was their 4th date. The first had been coffee at a place near the college where Isaac taught. The second had been a walk along the river path that wound behind the old textile mills, during which Isaac had pointed out 6 different species of birds and gotten 4 of them wrong and admitted it cheerfully. The third had been dinner at a Thai restaurant where the owner's daughter had spilled a glass of water on Isaac's lap, and he had apologized to her. And now this, Lariones, candles and wine and Chet Baker and the sound of rain against arched windows. Marit had chosen this restaurant because no one she knew came here, because it was across the city from the neighborhoods Dominic controlled, because the tables were spaced far apart and the lighting was low and the door was visible from every seat in the room. She had chosen it, in other words, the way she now chose everything, with one eye on beauty and the other on the exit. She hadn't told Isaac about Dominic. Not yet. Not the full truth. She had said only that her last relationship had been difficult and that she was still finding her way back to herself. Isaac had nodded and said, "Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." And he'd meant it in a way that didn't sound like a warning. Marit lifted her wine glass and looked at Isaac across the candle flame. For a moment, just a moment, the arithmetic of survival, the constant calculations of risk and distance and visibility, went quiet inside her head. And in the silence that remained, she heard something she hadn't heard in years, her own voice, relaxed, unguarded, laughing at a story about a cereal box. She didn't know that across the street, behind the tinted glass of a black sedan, a man who had once told her she would never belong to anyone else was watching her laugh with a stillness that could shatter glass. She didn't know, but something in her body did. Some deep, animal frequency that had been tuned by years of living inside a beautiful, terrible silence. Because halfway through her next sentence, without knowing why, Marit glanced toward the window. She saw nothing but rain, but her shoulders rose half an inch, and the arithmetic started again. The night Marit left Dominik Sarova, she did not pack a bag. She had thought about it. For months, she had thought about it. She had imagined the careful assembly, documents in a folder, clothes folded into a duffel, the small wooden box her mother had given her on her 18th birthday that held a pair of garnet earrings and a handwritten note that said, "You are allowed to choose yourself." She had rehearsed the departure in her mind the way prisoners rehearse escape routes, tracing every step, every door, every possible point of interception, until the plan was so detailed it became its own kind of prison. But when the moment came, there was no plan. There was only a single sentence and what it revealed. They had been in the kitchen of the penthouse on Rathmore Terrace. It was a beautiful kitchen. Italian marble, copper fixtures, a window that overlooked the city skyline like a painting no one had asked for. Dominik had designed the entire apartment himself. Every surface, every angle, every sightline. He had once told her, during the first year, when she still believed his control was care, that he had built this home so that nothing ugly could touch her. She had thought it was romantic. She didn't understand until later that what he meant was that nothing could reach her, including the outside world. That night, Dominik had come home at 11. He'd been at a meeting, the kind of meeting that left no minutes and no witnesses. He'd poured himself a glass of whiskey, stood at the kitchen island, and looked at her the way he sometimes did when something had gone wrong in his world, and he needed to reassert order in the one space he considered entirely his. "You changed your hair," he said. She hadn't. She had tucked it behind her ears differently. That was all. "I didn't." "Don't lie to me, Marit." "I'm not lying." I tucked it back. "It's the same." He set the glass down. The sound it made against the marble was barely audible, but Maret heard it the way a bird hears the snap of a branch, not as a sound, but as a signal. "When I tell you something about yourself," he said, "the correct response is to listen, not to argue. I know you better than you know yourself. I always have." The sentence landed in the kitchen like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples it sent outward touched every wall, every surface, and every carefully designed inch of the penthouse that Marit had spent 3 years learning to call home, while slowly forgetting what home meant. "I know you better than you know yourself." She stood there, holding a glass of water, looking at a man who was not yelling, not threatening, and not raising a hand. A man who was simply, calmly, with absolute conviction, telling her that her own perception of her own body was wrong. And she understood. Not suddenly, not like a lightning strike, but like the last drop of water that finally sends the glass spilling over the edge, that this was the violence. Not the nights he had grabbed her wrist hard enough to leave a bruise she would explain away as a stumble. Not the morning he had thrown her phone against the bedroom wall because she had smiled at a text from a colleague. Not the time he had locked the apartment door from the outside and left her alone for 14 hours without explanation, then returned with flowers and told her he needed to know she would wait for him. All of those had been terrible, but this calm, quiet certainty that he owned the truth of who she was, this was the architecture. Everything else was just furniture. Maret set the glass of water down. She picked up her coat from the back of the chair. She walked toward the front door. "Where are you going?" Dominic asked. Not alarmed, curious, the way a man asks when he is certain the answer will be nowhere. "Out." "Out where?" She didn't answer. She opened the door. "Maret." His voice hardened by exactly 1 degree. "If you walk through that door right now, you need to understand what that means." She walked through the door. She did not take the garnet earrings. She did not take the wooden box. She did not take any of the clothes he had bought her, the jewelry he had selected for her, the books he had placed on her nightstand, because he believed he knew what she should read. She took her coat, her ID, her phone, and a credit card attached to an account he did not know about. One she had opened 7 months earlier at a bank branch across the city, depositing small amounts of cash whenever she could. $20 here, $50 there, accumulated in the pockets of her coat and the lining of her purse like seeds buried against a winter she prayed would never come. The account held $2,340. It was not enough. It was everything. She drove for 3 hours that night. She checked into a motel on the outskirts of Karenna, a town she had passed through once on a road trip years ago and remembered only because the gas station attendant had been kind to her for no reason. She locked the door. She sat on the bed. She did not cry. She called one person, her older cousin, Tassia, who lived 4 states away and who she hadn't spoken to in over a year because Dominic had described Tassia as unstable and a bad influence, enough times that Marette had eventually stopped reaching out. Tassia answered on the second ring. "Marette, is everything okay?" "I left him." A pause. Then Tassia's voice, raw and immediate. "Tell me where you are. Right now. Tell me where you are." Tassia had wired her $1,500 the next morning. She had given her the name of a woman in the city, Fenella Brask, a domestic crisis counselor who worked with women leaving controlling relationships. Fenella had met Marette at a coffee shop 2 days later, listened to everything, and said 5 words that Marette wrote on the back of a receipt and kept in her wallet for the next 3 months. "You are not his story." Marette had built her new life the way you rebuild a house after a flood. Slowly, from the foundation up, checking every beam before you trust it with weight. She had found a small apartment in Sable Crossing, a neighborhood far enough from Dominic's territory that she could breathe. Close enough to the college where she worked as an administrative coordinator that she could walk on mornings when the weather allowed it. She had changed her phone number. She had closed every social media account. She had learned to shop at different grocery stores on a rotating schedule because Dominic had people everywhere, and people who worked for Dominic had a habit of noticing things. 3 months became 4. 4 became 5. The flinching subsided. Not completely, but enough. She stopped checking the rearview mirror every 30 seconds. She started sleeping through the night more often than not. She cooked meals for herself that she chose because she wanted them, not because someone had opinions about what she should eat. She read books she picked from the library's shelf by running her fingers along the spines and stopping wherever they wanted to stop. She had not expected Isaac. She had not been looking. He had appeared the way decent things sometimes appear, without announcement, without pressure, like a door left open in a room you'd assumed had no exits. And now she was sitting in Larion's, laughing at a story about a cereal box. And for 4.5 minutes, she had forgotten the arithmetic entirely. 4.5 minutes. A new record. Dominic Sarova had not always been what he was now. The people who knew him, and there were very few who knew him as opposed to fearing him or serving him or both, understood that the man who controlled the eastern corridor of the city's underground economy had been built, not born. Built by a father named Rogan Sarova, who had run the same territory 30 years earlier with a method that could be described in a single word: erasure. Rogan did not punish disloyalty. He erased it. He removed people from rooms, from records, from memory. He had once told a 12-year-old Dominic, sitting across from him at a kitchen table in a house on Stroven Hill, that the most dangerous thing in the world was not violence. It was attachment. "Love something," Rogan had said, "and you've given someone a weapon to use against you. The only safe position is to need nothing and no one." Dominic had learned the lesson. He had learned it so well that by the time he was 25, he had taken over his father's operation and refined it into something Rogan himself would not have recognized: smoother, quieter, more sophisticated. Where Rogan had used force, Dominic used precision. Where Rogan had erased, Dominic absorbed. He didn't destroy his rivals. He made them dependent on him, which was slower and far more effective. But there was one lesson Dominic had failed to learn from his father, because it was the one lesson Rogan had been wrong about. Dominic could not stop himself from loving. He had loved his mother, Vesna, a Croatian woman with steady hands and a voice that could calm a room without raising itself above a whisper. Vesna had endured Rogan's coldness the way stone endures weather, by becoming harder on the surface and keeping everything soft, buried deep where it couldn't be reached. She had died when Dominic was 19, a stroke, sudden, in the kitchen on Stroven Hill, with a pot of coffee still warming on the stove. Dominic had found her on the floor. Rogan had not attended the funeral. He had sent flowers with a card that read, "She was a good woman," as if that were enough, as if that were anything at all. And Dominic had loved Marette. He had loved her the way he loved everything, completely, consumingly, and with a conviction that made no distinction between devotion and control. He had believed, with a sincerity that made it worse rather than better, that keeping her close was the same as keeping her safe, that monitoring her movements was attentiveness, that choosing her clothes and her friends and her schedule was care, that his jealousy was proof of depth, not damage. When she left, he had stood in the kitchen of the penthouse on Rathmore Terrace for 45 minutes without moving. He had looked at the glass of water she had set on the counter and not touched it. He had not called her. He had not sent anyone after her. Not that night. That night he had simply stood in the kitchen and felt something he had not felt since he was 19 years old, kneeling beside his mother's body on the floor of a house on Stroven Hill. Loss. Not anger. Not yet. The anger would come later, in waves, in the weeks that followed, when the phone number was disconnected and the apartment she rented couldn't be found and the people he sent to look came back with nothing. The anger was secondary, a structure built on top of something much older and much more frightening. The fear that his father had been right, that loving something only gave the world a weapon, and that he had handed Marit the blade and she had used it to cut herself free. For 3 months, Dominic had maintained a discipline that surprised even his inner circle. He had not searched for her. He had not dispatched anyone. He had sat inside the penthouse and run his business and attended his meetings and spoken to his lawyers and done everything a man in his position was supposed to do while carrying, beneath the surface, a wound that would not stop bleeding because he would not stop pressing on it. Then, on a Tuesday night in late November, Brennan had driven him past Sable Crossing on the way to a meeting in the South End, and Dominic had glanced through the sedan window and seen, through the arched glass of a restaurant he had never noticed before, a woman with dark auburn hair cut short to the jawline leaning across a candlelit table and laughing. And every wall he had spent 3 months building collapsed in the time it took his heart to beat twice. "Stop the car," he said. Brennan stopped. Dominic watched. He watched her lift a wine glass. He watched her smile at a man he didn't recognize. He watched the man reach across the table and touch her hand. And he watched Marette. His Marette. The woman he had built a penthouse around. The woman he had loved with a ferocity that had eventually become indistinguishable from captivity. Let another man's fingers rest on hers without pulling away. "Who is he?" Dominic asked. The sedan was silent. "Who is he?" he asked again. And this time the question wasn't about the man across the table. It was about something far larger and far more dangerous. The realization that Marette had not just left him. She had moved on. She had rebuilt. She had found a restaurant with candles and a man who made her laugh, and a version of herself that existed entirely outside the walls Dominic had constructed. She had, in the most fundamental sense, erased him. And Dominic Sarova, who had inherited his father's empire and his father's methods, and his father's belief that erasure was the ultimate power, was now on the other side of it. For the first time in his life, he was the one who had been removed. Dominic did not go to the meeting that night. He told Brennan to circle the block, then to park, then to wait. The sedan sat at the far edge of the parking lot behind Larion's for 47 minutes while the rain thinned to a mist and the streetlights on Cathedral Street painted wet yellow circles on the asphalt. Kostel and Urek said nothing. Brennan kept the engine running and his eyes forward. No one in that car was foolish enough to speak first. Dominic watched through the window as the shapes inside the restaurant moved in the soft amber glow. He could see Marette's silhouette. He could see her tilt her head. He could see the man across from her lean forward the way men lean forward when they are listening, genuinely listening, not performing attentiveness, not cataloging information for later use, but listening the way Dominic had never learned to listen because listening required a kind of surrender he had always equated with weakness. At 9:47, Marette and the man stood from the table. Dominic watched them walk toward the door. The man held Marette's coat open for her. Not possessively, not insistently, just held it. And she turned and slipped her arms in and said something that made him smile. They stepped outside. The man opened an umbrella and held it over both of them, tilting it slightly toward Marette so that his own left shoulder caught the rain. Dominic noted that. The tilt. Such a small gesture. The kind of thing a man does without thinking when he cares more about someone else's comfort than his own. Dominic had never tilted an umbrella in his life. They walked east along Cathedral. The man's car was parked 2 blocks away, a dark green Volvo with a dent in the rear bumper and a university parking sticker on the windshield. Dominic watched the man open the passenger door for Marette. She got in. He walked around to the driver's side, paused, looked up at the rain as if deciding whether he liked it, and then got in. The Volvo pulled away. "Follow them," Dominic said. Brennan hesitated for exactly 1 second. Then he put the sedan in gear. They followed at a distance, 2 blocks behind, then 3. The Volvo crossed into the residential grid south of Sable Crossing, turned onto a street called Pender Lane, and stopped in front of a small brick apartment building with a blue awning and a row of ground-floor windows that were dark except for one, where a lamp glowed behind a sheer curtain. Marette got out. The man got out with her. They stood on the sidewalk for a moment, talking. Then the man put his hand on Marette's arm, gently, briefly, the way you touch someone you're not yet sure you're allowed to touch, and said something that made her look at the ground and smile. She went inside alone. The man waited until a light came on in a second-floor window, then got back in his car and drove away. Dominic stared at the second-floor window. The light behind the curtain was warm and steady. He imagined Marette inside, removing her coat, setting down her keys, maybe standing in front of a mirror and looking at a version of herself that he had never been allowed to see. The version that existed when he wasn't watching. "Take me home," Dominic said. No one in the car breathed until the sedan had turned the corner. By Thursday, Urek had assembled a file. The man's name was Isaac Mendre, 35, born in Lasko, Slovenia. Emigrated to the United States at age 11 with his mother, a schoolteacher named Danica, and his younger sister Petra. Father deceased. A factory accident when Isaac was 8. No criminal record. No debts. No affiliations. He taught modern European history at Hargrove Community College, where he had worked for 6 years. His students liked him. His colleagues described him as quiet, thorough, and unexpectedly funny. He lived in a rented apartment above a hardware store on Kelso Avenue. He drove the green Volvo. He owned a bicycle. He volunteered on Saturdays at a literacy center in the Moro district, teaching English to recent immigrants. Jurek placed the folder on Dominic's desk in the study on Rathmore Terrace. Dominic opened it. He read every page. He studied the photograph Jurek had taken from across the street. Isaac walking to his car, jacket over his arm, a canvas bag of books hanging from his shoulder. An ordinary man. A man who held umbrellas at the right angle and taught history to people who wanted to learn and waited on the sidewalk until a light came on in a second-floor window before driving away. Dominic closed the folder. "Does he know about me?" he asked. "No indication that he does." "Does she talk about me?" "We don't have that kind of access." "Get it." Jurek paused. That would mean getting closer. To her routines. Her workplace. I said get it. Jurek left the room. Dominic sat at his desk for a long time. The study was dark, except for the desk lamp, which threw a circle of light across the folder and his hands and nothing else. The rest of the room, the bookshelves, the leather chairs, the window overlooking the city, existed in shadow. He opened the folder again. He looked at the photograph of Isaac Mendre. And he asked himself a question he was not prepared to answer. What does that man have that I don't? The answer came immediately, unbidden, from a part of him that had been sealed off so long ago he had forgotten it existed. Nothing to prove. Dominic closed the folder again and pressed his thumb against the bridge of his nose. Somewhere in the apartment, a clock ticked. The penthouse was enormous. 3,000 square feet of polished stone and designer silence, and windows that overlooked a city that answered to his name. And it was, at this moment, the loneliest place on earth. The following Tuesday, Dominic went to Larion's. Not to the parking lot. Not to the sedan. He walked through the front door at 6:15 p.m., 90 minutes before Marit's reservation, which Jurek had confirmed that morning. He wore a charcoal suit, no tie, a wool overcoat draped over his arm. The bell above the door rang. The owner, a man named Dosh with silver hair and careful hands, looked up from behind the bar and recognized him. Not personally, but categorically. The way certain people recognized certain other people. The way a rabbit recognizes a shadow. "A table," Dominic said. "By the window. I'll be dining alone." Dosh seated him without comment. Dominic ordered a glass of red wine he didn't drink. He sat with his back to the wall and watched the door and waited. He didn't know what he was going to do. For the first time in as long as he could remember, Dominic Serova did not have a plan. He had only a feeling, vast, unstructured, and terrifying in its formlessness, that if he sat in this restaurant long enough, the feeling would resolve itself into something he could act on. At 7:48, the bell rang. Marit walked in. She was wearing a dark green dress and a scarf the color of burnt copper. Her hair was tucked behind her left ear. She was alone. Isaac hadn't arrived yet. She saw Dominic immediately. The human body is capable of extraordinary calculations in moments of recognition. In the space of a single heartbeat, Maret's nervous system performed a complete threat assessment. Distance to the door, number of people in the room, location of the kitchen exit, weight of the wine bottle on the nearest table. Her face did not change. Her step did not falter. But the color left her cheeks in a way that only someone who knew her very well would notice, and Dominic knew her very well. She stopped 3 steps inside the door. "Hello, Maret," Dominic said. His voice carried across the room the way smoke carries, without effort, without apology, filling every space it touched. Maret did not respond. She stood in the doorway and looked at the man who had spent every day of their relationship convincing her that love and surveillance were the same word, and something inside her, something she had spent 5 months carefully rebuilding, listed to one side like a ship taking on water. "Don't run," she told herself. "Running is what he expects." Running confirms that he still controls the geometry of your fear. She walked to the bar. She sat on a stool. She did not sit at his table. She did not approach him. She placed herself in neutral territory, visible to the room, within earshot of Dash, and she ordered a glass of water with a voice that did not shake, though the effort of keeping it steady cost her more than anyone in that room would ever know. Dominic watched her sit at the bar. He had expected one of three things: retreat, confrontation, or collapse. She had chosen none of them. She had chosen a fourth option he hadn't anticipated, which was to simply exist in the same room as him without acknowledging his gravitational pull. It unsettled him more than any of the other three would have. He stood. He picked up his untouched glass of wine and walked to the bar and sat 2 stools away from her. Not beside her, not across from her. 2 stools away, close enough to speak, far enough to give her the geometry of choice. "You cut your hair," he said. "Yes." "It looks good." Marit took a sip of water. Her hand was steady. "What are you doing here, Dominic?" "Having dinner." "You don't eat in Sable Crossing. You don't eat anywhere south of Rathmore. People change." "No," Marit said, still looking at the bar. "People like you don't change. You adapt. It's not the same thing." The sentence hung between them. Dominic felt it land, felt the precision of it, the surgical quality, the way she had separated 2 words that most people treated as synonyms and revealed the chasm between them. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said. "Your presence is trouble. You know that. You've always known that. It's the thing you've relied on your entire life." Dominic set his wineglass on the bar. He looked at it, then at her. "I saw you here last week, through the window. You were laughing." Marit's jaw tightened. "You were watching me." "I was driving past." "You don't drive past anything, Dominic. You drive to things." Another silence. Dash moved quietly at the far end of the bar, polishing glasses with the practiced invisibility of a man who understood that certain conversations required witnesses who appeared not to be witnessing. "Who is he?" Dominic asked. "That's not your question to ask." "I'm asking it anyway." Marit turned on the stool and looked at him directly for the first time. Her hazel eyes, amber in the candlelight, held something he hadn't seen in them before. Not fear, not anger, not even defiance. Something quieter, something harder to fight than any of those. Certainty. "He is someone who asks me what I'm reading," Marit said. "He is someone who waits until I invite him in. He is someone who holds an umbrella tilted toward me so his own shoulder gets wet, and doesn't mention it, and doesn't keep score, and doesn't file it away as evidence that I owe him something." She paused. "He is everything you could have been if you had ever learned the difference between loving someone and monitoring them." Dominic didn't move. His face didn't change. But something behind his eyes, deep behind them, in the place where the 12-year-old boy still sat at a kitchen table listening to his father explain that attachment was weakness, shifted. A fissure opened where none had been before. Not a collapse, not a shattering, but the slow, seismic give of something that had been held rigid for too long. "I didn't come here to take you back," he said quietly. "Then why did you come?" The question sat between them like an open hand, and Dominic, who had built his life on certainty, on the absolute knowledge of his own intentions, found that he did not have an answer. He had come because the feeling was unstructured and vast. He had come because seeing her laugh had unlocked a part of him he'd spent decades sealing shut. He had come because somewhere beneath the architecture of control and power and precision, there was a man who had once knelt beside his mother's body on a kitchen floor and understood for the first time that love was not a strategy. It was a surrender. And Dominic Serova had never surrendered anything. "I don't know," he said. 2 words, spoken so quietly that Dosh at the far end of the bar didn't hear them. But Marit did. And she recognized something in those 2 words that she had never heard from Dominic in all the time they had shared a bed and a home, and his suffocating devotion. Honesty. Not the performed honesty of a man managing a situation. Not the tactical vulnerability of a man deploying weakness as strategy. But the raw, bewildered honesty of a man encountering a feeling he did not have the tools to process. "You don't know," Maret repeated. "No." She looked at him for a long time. The candles flickered. The rain had started again outside, tapping against the arched windows in irregular rhythms. "Then I'll tell you what I know," she said. "I know that for 3 years, you convinced me that your jealousy was love. I know that you monitored my phone, my friendships, my schedule, and my appearance. And you called it protection. I know that you never hit me, and you will use that fact like a shield for the rest of your life. But you built a cage so beautiful and so complete that I forgot what the sky looked like." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't waver. It carried the same terrible calm that Dominic's voice carried when he was at his most dangerous, and he recognized the quality because she had learned it from him. "I know that the night I left, you stood in the kitchen for 45 minutes. Jurek told me he called Tasya because he was worried about what you might do. And I know that you didn't come after me. And I spent 2 months trying to figure out whether that was mercy or strategy, and I finally realized it was neither. It was shock. You genuinely could not believe that I would choose to leave, because you had so thoroughly convinced yourself that your cage was a home that you couldn't comprehend why anyone would want to walk out of it." She took a breath. "I'm not angry anymore, Dominic. I was. For months. But anger is a leash too, and I've cut all of mine. What I am now is clear. I see you. I see what you did. And I see that you didn't do it out of cruelty. You did it because you were taught that love is control, and you never questioned the lesson." She picked up her glass of water and took a small sip. "But understanding why you are the way you are does not obligate me to stand inside the blast radius while you figure out how to be different. If you ever do." The bar was silent. Somewhere in the kitchen, a pot clanged softly. The Chet Baker record had ended, and no one had replaced it, so the only sound was rain and breathing and the quiet creak of the building settling into its own bones. Dominic looked at his hands on the bar. They were large hands, capable hands, hands that had signed documents that rearranged lives and held a 19-year-old's dead mother and gripped the edge of a sedan window while watching a woman laugh with another man. And right now, they were perfectly still, resting on the wood like objects that had been set down and might not be picked up again. "My mother," he said, and stopped. He pressed his lips together, started again. "My mother was the only person who ever loved me without conditions, and my father told me that was her weakness, and I believed him. I built everything, everything, on the belief that love without control was love without structure, and love without structure would collapse." He looked at Marit. "You didn't collapse. You built something better. Without me." The sentence cost him more than any sentence he had ever spoken. More than orders that had changed the landscape of the city. More than the single word, "Stay," he had once said to a man who had betrayed him, knowing what would follow. This sentence cost him the one thing his father had told him never to spend: certainty. Marit watched his face. She watched the mask shift, not the half-inch adjustments she had seen him make in boardrooms and back offices, but something deeper, something involuntary. And behind it was not the man who ran an empire. Behind it was a boy sitting at a kitchen table absorbing a lesson that would take him 30 years to unlearn, if he ever unlearned it at all. "That's the first true thing you've said to me in 4 years," she whispered. The bell above the door rang. Cold air swept across the floor. Isaac Mendre walked in, shaking rain from his umbrella, his canvas bag over one shoulder, his face carrying the open, unhurried expression of a man arriving somewhere he wanted to be. He saw Marit at the bar. He smiled. Then he saw the man sitting 2 stools away, and the smile didn't disappear. It recalibrated. Isaac was not a man who operated in the world Dominic occupied, but he was a man who had grown up in a country where you learned to read rooms quickly, and this room had a frequency he recognized. "Everything okay?" Isaac asked, directing the question to Marit alone. Marit looked at him. Then she looked at Dominic. And in that single glance, that fractional turn of the head from one man to the other, was the entire geography of her transformation, from a woman who asked permission to a woman who made choices. "Everything's fine," she said, and for the first time in 4 years, when Marit Vale said those words, they were not a lie. She stood from the stool. She picked up her glass of water. She walked to the booth in the corner, red vinyl, window to the parking lot, and sat down across from Isaac Mendre, who was already telling her about something his sister Petra had texted him, something involving a dog and a suitcase and an airport security line, and Marit was already beginning to laugh. Dominic watched her go. He watched her sit. He watched the candlelight catch her face as she leaned forward, and he saw the same thing he had seen through the sedan window a week ago, a woman who had found a way to laugh without checking first whether it was allowed. He left a $100 bill on the bar. He stood. He put on his coat. Dosh, still polishing glasses at the far end, looked at him briefly. Their eyes met. Dominic gave the smallest nod, not a command, not an instruction, but an acknowledgement. The kind of nod a man gives when he is leaving a place he knows he will not return to. He walked to the door. He did not look at the corner booth. He did not look at Marit. He pushed the door open, and the bell rang, and the cold November air hit his face like a hand pressing against his chest. Outside, the sedan was waiting. Brennan behind the wheel, Costel in the back. Jurek leaning against the passenger door, his phone in his hand, already preparing for whatever instruction was coming next. Dominic stood on the sidewalk. The rain had softened to something barely more than mist. The streetlights on Cathedral stretched their reflections across the wet asphalt. "Boss?" Jurek said. Dominic looked at the restaurant one last time. Through the fogged glass, he could see the glow of candlelight. He could see, faintly, the shapes of 2 people in a corner booth. He could see one of them lean forward, gesturing with her hands the way she always did when she was telling a story she cared about, and he could see the other one listening with his whole body angled toward her, the way a plant turns toward light. "Close the file," Dominic said. Jurek blinked. "The file on..." "Close it, delete it, all of it. The photographs, the surveillance notes, the address, the schedule, everything." "Boss, are you..." "I'm not going to say it twice." Jurek looked at Brennan. Brennan looked at the steering wheel. Costel, in the back seat, looked at his own hands. "It's done," Jurek said quietly. Dominic got in the car. He sat in the back seat and looked straight ahead. The sedan pulled away from the curb and turned onto Cathedral and drove north, away from Sable Crossing, away from Larione's, away from the arched windows and the candlelight and the sound of a bell ringing above a door. In the back seat, Dominic reached into his coat pocket and took out his phone. He scrolled to a contact he had not opened in 3 months. Maret's name. Her old number. Disconnected. Useless. A ghost in his directory. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he deleted it. Not the way his father would have deleted it. With coldness. With erasure. With the clinical removal of a thing that had outlived its usefulness. Dominic deleted it the way his mother would have. With grief. With tenderness. With the understanding that letting go of something you love is not a defeat. It is the only form of love that asks nothing in return. The sedan turned onto Rathmore and climbed the hill toward the penthouse. The city spread out below them, wet and glittering, its lights blurred by rain into something that looked almost soft. Dominic did not look at it. He looked at the empty space on his phone where her name had been and felt the weight of his father's lesson finally, slowly, begin to lift. Not all at once. Not completely. The way a bruise fades, in stages, in gradients, the darkest purple giving way to something yellowed and tender before it disappears entirely. It would take time. It might take years. There were rooms inside Dominic Sarova that had been locked since he was 12, and opening them would require a kind of courage that had nothing to do with the kind he'd spent his adult life practicing. But tonight, in the back seat of a sedan driving through the rain, a man who had been taught that love was ownership sat with an empty contact list and a closed file, and the memory of a woman laughing in candlelight. And he did not reach for the phone. He did not tell Brennan to turn around. He did not issue a single instruction that would pull her back into the orbit of his control. He let her go. And somewhere inside the penthouse on Rathmore Terrace, in the kitchen with the Italian marble and the copper fixtures and the window overlooking a city that answered to his name, the glass of water Moret had set on the counter 5 months ago, the one Dominic had never touched, never moved, never allowed anyone to clear, sat exactly where she had left it. Tomorrow, he would put it away. Not tonight. Tonight was for letting the fissure widen, for sitting in the silence of an enormous apartment and hearing, for the first time, how empty it sounded when it wasn't filled with the presence of someone who had never been free to leave. But tomorrow he would put the glass away. He would open a window. He would let the cold air in and stand in it and feel it against his face, the way he had felt the November rain on the sidewalk outside Larion's. Not as discomfort, but as evidence. Evidence that the world outside the cage existed, and that it was large, and that it did not answer to his name, and that this, perhaps, was not a threat. Perhaps it was the point. Back inside Larion's, the bell above the door had stopped ringing. The Chet Baker record had been replaced by something softer. A woman's voice singing in Portuguese, low and warm, like a hand resting on the small of your back. Marit and Isaac sat in the corner booth. The candle between them had burned to its midpoint. The wine was almost gone. Isaac was telling her about a student who had written an entire essay about the fall of the Berlin Wall, using only song lyrics as citations, and Marit was laughing. Not the careful, calibrated laugh she had worn like armor for so long, but the real one. The one that started somewhere in her diaphragm and rose through her chest and arrived at her mouth already smiling. Isaac watched her laugh and thought, not for the first time, that he had never met anyone who laughed as though they were surprised by their own joy. "You okay?" he asked. Not about the man at the bar. He hadn't asked about that, and wouldn't unless she offered. Just a general question. The kind of question that requires nothing except an honest answer. Marit looked at him across the table. The candlelight made his face warm and close. His eyes were steady, patient, incurious in the way that only genuinely curious people can be. The kind of incurious that says, "I'm interested in whatever you want to tell me, whenever you want to tell it." "I'm okay," she said. And she was. Not completely. Not yet. There were still nights when she checked the deadbolt twice, still mornings when the sound of a car engine idling outside her building made her stomach tighten, still moments when she caught herself asking permission for things that required no permission, choosing a restaurant, buying a book, wearing her hair the way she wanted to wear it. But she was okay the way a bone is okay after it heals, stronger in the broken place, tender when the weather changes, but whole, functional, capable of bearing weight again. "Can I ask you something?" Isaac said. You can ask me anything. Do you want dessert? Because I've been staring at the chocolate tart on the menu for 20 minutes and I need moral support. Marit smiled. Not the complicated smile of a woman still processing all that damage. A simple smile, the kind that means yes. Get the tart, she said. Isaac signaled the waitress. The Portuguese song ended and another began. Rain tapped against the arched windows in rhythms that sounded, if you listened closely enough, almost like applause. And on Pender Lane, in a small brick apartment building with a blue awning, a second-floor window glowed with a light that had been left on. Not by accident, but by habit. The habit of a woman who had learned that coming home to a lit window meant coming home to something that was hers. A lamp she had chosen. A room she had arranged. A door with a deadbolt she controlled. The light stayed on. The rain continued. And somewhere between a restaurant on the corner of Voss and Cathedral and an apartment on a quiet street in Sable Crossing, a woman who had once forgotten what the sky looked like was slowly, carefully, learning to live beneath it again. Not perfectly. Not yet, but enough.